Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and we are obviously living through an unprecedented moment in history. This is a moment where the United States, and to some degree the world, has been willing to finally look at the gaping wound of racism and what it's doing to us. As Americans, we know that this wound is a central part of our origin story, but what feels different about this time is the degree to which those of us who are outside of the Black community are willing to not only examine our privilege, but are willing to examine the ways in which we have subtly and sometimes not so subtly contributed to the dishonoring and the disenfranchisement of our Black brothers and sisters. This is a 400-year-long list, as we know, but near the top of it should be acknowledging the ways in which we have underappreciated the contributions of the Black community to so much of what we take for granted and so much of what we consider sacred. The movie Hidden Figures captured this concept in the story of 3 Black women who were behind very successful missions at NASA and whose stories were not widely known about until recently. A Course in Miracles has its own hidden figure, and that's what we're here to talk about today with our guest, Freedom Cartwright. Freedom is a student and teacher of A Course in Miracles and the founder of Freedom Rail Tours in Alabama. Her work focuses on sharing history, racial injustice and healing, and Freedom has spent many years teaching course-based forgiveness as a path towards cultural reconciliation. Freedom, it is an honor to be here with you today. For those who are unfamiliar with your work, can you just take a moment to share a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor for me as well, and for all of my ancestors. I started becoming aware of this deep sense of shame that I had as a Black American about lynching and enslavement and the current manifestations in terms of incarceration of Black bodies. And it's interesting, why would I feel shame, right? But that's how my ancestors experienced this inability to be the captain of their own ship. And feeling of shame really rose up, and I started to just really become aware of it. I needed to do something. I needed to be able to go and look directly at what was scaring me, what I was ashamed of. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that I had nothing to be ashamed of. And B, there was enormous healing in being available to the voices that hadn't been heard. There's so many voices that had been silenced, whether by lynching, just by the fact that if you're enslaved, you may not read or write, your story has never been told. And as I went through not just my family story, but the story of Black America, I just became floored. My heart became so full of the power, the dignity, the embodiment of the greatest ideals of this country that Black people have brought and continue to bring to this amazing experiment called democracy. And I realized it was one of my purposes to be able to tell this American story. I see us as a family, and to be able to bring together the various members of the family so that we can really understand that we are one family, and we have so much to share and so many ways in which we can heal one another. So I started a company where I bring people mostly from the North down to the South, and I allow them to be in deep conversation and relation with Black people on every level. Everyone that serves the people I bring are Black. The people who cook the food are Black. The houses we stay on are owned by Black people. Everyone who brings us on a tour is Black. We get included in their families and their communities, and the conversations that people are able to have are unprecedented. And the healing that comes through these conversations is extraordinary. So that's just a bit about where I'm coming from as a course student and teacher in terms of bringing the principles of A Course in Miracles, that, I'm not this body. I'm something greater, and so is everyone. And being able to bring that reality and this seeming separation together.
Well, you say that part of your work is being available to voices who haven't been heard. And one of those voices is very central to the origin of the Course's story. And I assume that you first learned about Helen's maid and governess, Georgia, in Ken Wapnick's book, Absence from Felicity, right?
Yes.
So can you tell us about what that was like for you and why you were so interested in Georgia as part of Helen's life and in her story?
Okay, sure. I'll be as brief as possible. I started giving racial healing workshops, and including Course in Miracles students. So I went to a conference in San Francisco where I gave a workshop called The Power to Heal Racism. And unbeknownst to me, there was a woman in that workshop who, the night that we had had the workshop during the day, she goes to sleep that night. And in the middle of the night, Georgia wakes her up. She is awakened, like whoosh, she just sits up in bed and she's like, Georgia, Georgia. So the next day, she runs up to me, and she looked like she had seen a ghost. I was like, whoa, what's going on with you? And she said, I have to tell you this. So she recounts this tale and she goes, I had been reading Absence from Felicity. I read about Helen's maid, Georgia, and she goes, we got to find out about this person. And that was the first I had heard about it.
What
And
year was that?
that was 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it's 2 years. No, it was 20. Yeah, maybe it was 2018. So yeah, 2 years ago. So I said, we've got to look into this. And then she and I, her name is Laura Yates Campoli. She and I just started asking everyone. I asked everyone who I thought might know. Not too many people did. So I just continued asking and asking, writing letters, asking who else could I ask. And as I was trying to piece together who this person was, I just started getting like downloads. Like, this is really, really important. And I felt inadequate to the task. But all I kept hearing about this was, do not stop looking. This is really important. And this story has everything to do with the healing of the soul of this country. This story about the presence of Black people in the creation, in the what turned into A Course in Miracles, is so important. And for somebody who has been seeing how powerful these voices that have been silenced, how powerful these voices are, it was important to me. I mean, it was right up my alley. So that's basically how I got here.
Okay, so we have teased people enough about Georgia and who she is. Robert, I'd like to bring you in at this point. Can you tell us a bit about your understanding of Georgia based on your knowledge of the history of A Course in Miracles? Can you share with us who she is?
Yeah. Freedom and I met, of course, a year ago in Boston. We talked about this, and I didn't know very much. And I think I encouraged you to write certain people who might know more,
Mm-hmm.
not realizing that I think probably the best information we have is in Helen's autobiography and in sort of her original unedited autobiography. Anyway, so what I've gleaned from that and Ken Wapnick's remarks in Absence from Felicity is that Helen, before she was school age, she had a British governess, Miss Richardson, And at that time, a woman that was later called Georgia in Absence from Felicity and in Helen's published autobiography, was there as the cook, and Helen named her as Idabel. And it's obvious that Idabel was her name because that name was changed later, presumably in an attempt to protect her identity. And those publications were closer to the life of Idabel. But if Idabel was already like a pseudonym, you wouldn't need to change it. So clearly her name was Idabel. And she was around at that time, before Helen was school aged. So 4, 5, maybe younger. Helen does, in the unedited autobiography, name her as a colored cook. So she was Black. She calls her at different points cook and maid. I guess she wasn't actually a governess, but she was a cook and a maid. And Helen, she was a part of Helen's life from that very young point in childhood until Idabel went into a nursing home in 1970 when Helen was 61. So this is the pretty much most of the span of Helen's whole life. She always talks about her as a friend. She always says that they had really good conversations. Ken Wapnick says she was one of the very, very few people in Helen's life to whom she exhibited no ambivalence. Huge statement. So she was not only a presence, she was someone that Helen felt, simply good about and towards. Helen, if you read her autobiography, it's painful how lonely she is within her family. Oh, it's just painful. She lives down at the other end of an apartment apart from her family, doesn't see much of her mother, has virtually no relationship with her father, has almost no relationship with her brother. Her father's a distant figure to everyone in his life. And Helen is so lonely. So she clearly found a lot of companionship in Idabel. Later on, she says she was virtually a member of the family. But where she really figures in Helen's autobiography, of course, is where Helen at age 13, she's had this attraction to God that she hasn't done much with. When Miss Richardson was around, when Helen was very, very small, she was attracted to and fascinated with Miss Richardson's Catholic Church. But Miss Richardson didn't really feel like she could introduce Helen to that because Helen's small and her parents should, be in charge of that process. So she encouraged Helen to talk to her parents about what religion they were. But she reaches 13 and she goes to Idabel's church. It's a Baptist church. It's obviously a Black church. And,
it's in Harlem.
And is it actually in Harlem?
In Harlem. Yeah.
Okay. And they, they're having, it's a really like lively church service. People are singing joyfully. People are shouting. People are speaking in tongues. And Helen was, she fell in love with the music, which was so joyful. B, she liked the sense of being on intimate and familiar terms with God. And C, she said she just felt at home there. So this was a huge involvement for her. She ends up getting baptized, not at that church because she finds out that to be baptized in a church means you're expected to join the church. And the minister said, maybe you should, join a church closer to your house. And so she ends up finding a minister who doesn't have a church who will baptize her. And she doesn't find the sense of connection with God that she hoped for. She ends up drifting away. But that involvement was so important that, according to Ken Wapnick, Louis said later that Idabel gave Helen, quote, her religious foundation in life, which is kind of huge given that search for God she was on culminated in all of us having A Course in Miracles. So whoever gave her the foundation in that search ends up becoming an important part of the story. as well as Isabel being this key part of Helen's life. It seems like she was a live-in maid
Mm-hmm.
all of those 50, 60 years.
So Isabel was not only a mother figure to Helen, who felt disconnected from her own mother, but I think in her autobiography, she mentions Isabel as being the person who she could feel was connected to God. She used to talk about Isabel closing her eyes and rocking back and forth, and she wanted the connection to God that Isabel had. And so
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Freedom, do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, well, I'm doing what Isabel used to do. I'm just rocking back and forth, just taking this in. We were sharing before this podcast that this is such an American story. You know, how is it that this woman appeared, spent her entire life in the house of a white family in New York? One of the things that we read in Absence from Felicity is that Isabel is from Alabama. Mm-hmm. And so what I know about that period of time in the early 1900s, that after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction. And that Reconstruction was followed by a backlash, essentially, where all the gains that Black people made after they were freed from enslavement were rolled back. It was called the Redemption in the South, in which basically a season of terror was opened up. That season began early in the 1900s, and it didn't end really until the Civil Rights Movement. But it involved a lot of lynching and all sorts of Black code laws in which Black people weren't allowed to, vote or have access to any of the government programs. So for a lot of Black people, millions in fact, there was something called the Great Migration, in which formerly enslaved Black people began moving north in droves, simply because once someone in your town is lynched who looks like you realize that your safety is tenuous, and they were encouraged to leave. People were like, yes, if you don't leave, we're going to do to you what we just did to your uncle. So Isabel's appearance in New York is part of a large wave of Black people coming from the South, from Alabama, from South Carolina, from Louisiana, from these deep South states. And my partner's mom, I was saying earlier, my partner's mom, who herself was born in the late 1800s, moved from South Carolina to Connecticut at the age of 12 and worked for a white family. She moved into their family and worked in that family until she got married. So this moving up from the South into the home, a white home, and basically, making that transition that way and seeing where life takes you it was common. It happened a lot.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast this morning that was echoing exactly what you're saying, Freedom, where after the Civil War, former slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule. Some actually received it, only to have it rescinded after Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson became president. So people who were promised land, tending that land, were told, sorry, it's not yours anymore. And then of course going into the lynchings and whatnot. So you can see where folks would be moving up north. That doesn't appear in Helen's autobiography, but you just putting that piece together with where she's from in Alabama, you can see that maybe that was part of her story too. One thing that does strike me in what...
And she does have no family.
She has
in New
no
York
family.
City.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
It is interesting.
One thing that strikes me, and you touched on this, Robert, and Freedom, you and I have spoken about this prior to our conversation today, is that Helen was lonely, searching for a connection with God. Her former governess, Miss Richardson, was a Catholic, as you mentioned, Robert, and it's not that the Catholic Church itself rejected her, but Miss Richardson would not let her go into the Catholic Church, wouldn't let her own a rosary because I don't know, we don't exactly know why, but the reason stated is she wasn't Catholic. And it could be, as Robert was saying, that Miss Richardson just didn't feel comfortable imparting her religion on a child, that she was it was more of a parental responsibility to do that. But Georgia, Idabel, wasn't like that at all. In the autobiography, she talks about going into Idabel's room and reading the Bible at night.
Yeah.
And also this introduction to Idabel's church, where she just developed this love of the community, love of the music, and to have that called her by Louis, Helen's own husband, her religious foundation, is so huge. Did you want to speak to that too? Because I know that you and I had spoken about the Catholicism versus the Baptist introduction to spirituality that Helen had.
I keep feeling Idabel's movement, like as you were saying, like her rocking. And what I know is that from what I read of Helen's experience in that Baptist church, what Helen got, and I think both of you said this, is this intimate experience of God. Like not this intellectual, far away, cerebral, but it got in her body, right? And it might be that was one of the few times Helen felt really comfortable, because my experience of Helen, as I read what she's written and how she didn't feel at home in her own body. She was so uncomfortable, so worried, so anxious. And I love being around Black people, because Black people are embodied people. Like, we move, we're loud, when we celebrate, when we're in religious context, man, it's like people are jumping and singing, and you don't want to stand too close to somebody because they start throwing their arms around and they could knock you out. And it's so different than Helen's description of her home, which was so, like, I always see it as dark, right? Like,
Icy.
People are in their rooms and you don't know what they're going through. And her mom was searching for this experience, this religious experience, and just searching, as if Helen wasn't enough. Her mom needed to go keep looking for something. So the Catholic experience of Helen having to be in the vestibule and or outside playing with that other little girl that she talks about, that was a friend of Miss Richardson's, had a girl that was her age. And so when Miss Richardson would go in to do her prayer in the church, Helen would be outside playing with this other little girl. And it's just such a juxtaposition that here's Miss Richardson, and essentially, Helen looks white. There's no reason Helen couldn't go in there, except Miss Richardson thinks that's not okay for whatever reason. But there Helen goes to Harlem, this little white girl. She goes into a church, probably the only white person in that entire establishment. And what happens when she goes in there is she's welcomed, like, come on in, celebrate with us. And she catches that spirit. And to me, that's also so much the American story, is that the Black community has been a welcoming community. Like, come on in here. We got some good stuff going on. Celebrate with us. So I love how many ways Helen's story with Idabel is helping us all to see how we're so interconnected. Our stories are so intertwined. And here we have A Course in Miracles, this incredible
Masterpiece.
Yes, it defies, I call it like an energy field. It's an energy field. And what went into that energy field manifesting is this lonely white child finding this Black woman who shows up in her family, who says, yes, yes, come with me. Yes, we can pray together. I think Helen, like you said, Helen used Idabel as a touchstone for practically her whole life. This person held the energy of love and God for Helen. While Helen did all this important work that, thank goodness, she did, we are so grateful. Idabel, the hidden figure, was holding the energy that gave Helen the ability to be available to do this work of A Course in Miracles. And that's why I probably have just never been able to rest. I kept thinking, I knew it was important. I just knew it. It's really a big deal.
I think it says so much that, as you're saying, the community at that church welcomed Helen to the point where she felt comfortable to request her own baptism there. And there's just a great story about how Idabel gave Helen 3 dimes. Have you ever heard of this?
This consecration
of 3 dimes. She gave Helen one, I believe, when she was baptized.
Collection.
But then she gave her another set of 3 dimes when she was married. And
well, you don't give them to Helen. You donate them to the church on Helen's behalf to get a special request fulfilled by God, I think.
Okay, so anyway, the point is that Idabel is introducing these rituals that really matter to Helen in her life. And even after Helen got married to Louis and they stayed living in the apartment with Helen's parents for a while, but even when they moved out of the apartment, Idabel went with them. And Idabel continued to live with Helen and Louis. We believe she lived with them.
It sure sounds like she lived with them.
Yeah. Up until she got too old to take care of herself and entered a nursing home in 1970. So the course started coming through in 65. Idabel has been with Helen from the point at which she's 3 or 4 years old, all the way up through her whole life until 1970, after the course comes in. And as Robert said, from the absence from Felicity, Idabel was one person to whom Helen displayed no ambivalence. Helen was very capable of being ambivalent. She was a pistol. But Idabel was a unique presence in her life. And that makes Idabel a unique presence in the story of A Course in Miracles that needs to be told.
Just a couple of things I want to add to that. One is that even though I think one can understand Miss Richardson's reticence somewhat, given that Helen was so young and versus being 13 when she goes to the Baptist church, the fact is that Helen's autobiography makes it really clear that Miss Richardson regarded her relationship with Helen just as a job. Yes. And she makes it really clear that Idabel genuinely cared about her. And I think that was the source of Helen's warmth and lack of ambivalence toward her. Another thing that's really interesting is Helen writes the first half of her autobiography before all the events of the course took place. And she ends that first half of her autobiography saying that, Idabel, what's her line? All the old
gods, only Georgia remains, but Idabel.
Yeah, Idabel. And she says Idabel is still praying for her at this point and saying she's sure the Lord is going to reveal himself to Helen. And that's pre-course. So it's kind of great that she has this faith in Helen's connection with God all the way along, even in decades where Helen's just not feeling it, not finding God. She thinks it's still going to happen. And of course it did.
That is huge. That is so huge. And I've always loved that line. I was actually going to close with it because it's so good that
Oh,
of
sorry.
all the old gods, only Idabel remained. And that just says so much about what Helen thought of her.
Yeah, I just keep going back to Idabel as the heart. Like, Idabel was a person around whom Helen could feel, right?
Mm,
Whenever I connect with Helen's energy, through her writing, and even through the way A Course in Miracles is written, it's so cerebral, right? There's a complexity to it that's beautiful, but also sometimes a little difficult to pierce. And I feel like Idabel was that octave that enabled Helen to go into her feeling space, which is so important. And I just feel like that's what Helen needed. She didn't need any extra people asking her to be smart. She had plenty of that. But what she didn't have very much of were people who could just meet her in her heart, because her heart was guarded. So I feel like that's what Idabel
mm,
did, was,
mm-hmm.
again, she held the energy field of love and kept that field
Mm.
open so Helen could come back, touch in. I mean, Idabel's confidence in Helen was Idabel's confidence in God, Idabel's connection with Jesus and her relationship with Jesus, which was a relationship. Black people's relationship with Jesus was a complete uh, and survival. It was a survival mechanism that became so deep that our being was indistinguishable from our relationship with Jesus. Because without Jesus, we had nothing. And that, the church was everything. It was the only place Black people were allowed to congregate without being, hurt and harmed. So Helen walked into a field, an energy field that had been created over the centuries by Black people, of a place of safety and acceptance and love. And it's something we all need. Everyone needs a place like that. And Helen was able to receive that succor, that warmth that she really needed to keep her going. I mean, there were several points where Helen didn't know what was her next step, and she felt hopeless and alone. And the power of Idabel's energy and love of God, I think, enabled Helen to keep moving forward.
Yeah, we will never know the degree to which Helen coming into that field cracked open what ultimately came through as A Course in Miracles. But I do know that Helen loved going into Catholic churches. She loved the buildings, but I know she didn't feel the connection, I don't think ever again in her life, that she felt in that church as a child before
The
she
Baptist
got
Church.
baptized. Yeah, the Baptist church.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, when you read the autobiography, sorry, were you
No,
continuing?
please.
When you read the autobiography, it's so lonely. It's so sterile. The only person she's got is Miss Richardson, who clearly doesn't really care and just wants to get out, save up money and get out. And so when Idabel comes in, who clearly does care, and takes her to this place of life and warmth and joy and intimacy with God, it's like someone, almost like, Helen's story going from black and white to color. It's like suddenly there's life there, and it's a real relief as you're reading the story.
So, Freedom, is there anything else that you want to say about Idabel before we talk about bringing her story to life? You mentioned Laura popping up in the middle of the night saying Georgia, and that started your search. And I have a continuation of that I want to share, because I know Laura, and she kind of passed the baton at one point to me, and I dropped it, and I want to talk about that and how we came to this conversation today. So is there anything else that you want to say about Isabel before we talk about the importance of sharing her story in the course community and how that came to be.
Well, one thing I realized, and when Robert was talking, I realized that it was in Boston. It wasn't in San Francisco. Robert, you're absolutely right. It was in Boston last year that I did the workshop and Laura and I met. So it was like Memorial Day weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So it was
Okay.
like 13 months ago. That's
Yeah.
when this all started. It wasn't San Francisco. But in terms of anything else about Isabel, I don't really have anything other than Isabel is in charge. What I'm understanding is that I didn't do anything. Isabel has a timeline, and her appearance is hers. She's showing up and she's making herself known because this is her time. And all I'm doing is just noticing and saying yes. And I believe that's what Laura Yates Campoli, Isabel woke Laura up because Isabel was ready to be known.
Shared.
And I'm not in charge of that. Jesus is in charge of that. Isabel's in charge of that as part of Jesus' team. And so that's all I can really say. That's basically, I've just enormous gratitude. And that's basically all I have to say about it.
I can give you proof that Isabel is in charge because...
Well,
Go ahead. No,
I don't know if we have proof, but something's going on.
Well,
something's going on. Yep.
Something's going on.
I can give you testimony that I feel Isabel. And after Boston, at the Community Miracles Center conference in Boston last year, Laura Campoli, who is a friend of mine, invited me to dinner, and she was fired up about Georgia and called her Georgia. We knew her as Georgia at this time, and was fired up about it. This story needs to be known. And I took the attitude of, having read Absence from Felicity, like, well, what do we really know about her? I mean, Robert was echoing this earlier, that was his attitude too, and I can confirm that, because when I went to you, Robert, and I was like, what do you know about Georgia? You're like, not much. And so there was passion around her from Laura and from you, and not a lot of interest, I'm embarrassed and ashamed to admit, from us. And from, I imagine, many people that you spoke with. You were knocking on a lot of doors and not getting them slammed in your face, but not getting any answers either. And so her story is meeting this moment. And that's what I meant in my intro, where we're finally willing to look at these hidden figures, you call them diamonds, in these stories, whose presence made a difference, whose presence matters. And so as we are looking at the history and the story of A Course in Miracles, Isabel is right in the center. It is no small thing to say that Isabel gave Helen her religious foundation. That is massive. It is no small thing to say that Helen experienced her first real connection with God at a Black church in Harlem. And it is no small thing to have Helen sneaking into Isabel's room reading the Bible when her governess before said she couldn't have a rosary because she wasn't Catholic. This is big. And so I am so embarrassed to say that I didn't see it when Laura was like practically jumping up and down at dinner, like, you need to care about this. And so I was bringing this up with Robert recently, and I was like, how important is this story? Because we were looking at what was going on in the world, and I was thinking of Georgia and Isabel, and Robert said, let's just ask for guidance. Okay, so we were asking for guidance, and I heard George is important. I heard it as Georgia, but George is important. And then he got his own guidance after that.
And so that got me much more on board, as well as hearing from Emily. Like she said, hey, I just got this, George is important. So we feel like we are being guided in this respect. I don't know if it's coming from Isabel herself. I have no idea, but we definitely feel guided, and we're trusting that.
Well, I want to just thank you both so much for asking for guidance and for receiving it and following it and affirming what I had been hearing. And as Emily said, it wasn't, nobody slammed the door in my face, but it was obvious that nobody kind of felt it was important, and it started to make me doubt. Like, I was like, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe this doesn't mean anything. But every time I tuned in, they were like, no, this is important. So I'm so excited for us, like for community. I'm so excited for our country. I'm so excited for our planet. To me, this is a sign and a symbol. And what does Jesus always say about, the blind will see and the deaf will hear. And we have, on so many levels, been blind to each other and not hearing each other on every respect, not just one way, on every respect. And I think we have realized that we can't continue that way, right? We have to do things differently. We as an American family have to listen to each other and have to seek first to understand. And I believe that Jesus and Isabel are offering us as Course in Miracles community a model. Like they're helping us to see through that example of that relationship how it's only if we're not willing to look that we could actually believe that we're separate. It's only if we're not willing to kind of pull back the layers. What we see when we pull back the layers is that, if we could see it, that my ancestors and your ancestors have overlapping, intertwining stories, that I can't pull my story outside of our story. That's impossible. So I just feel like we're being given an enormous gift. I am not at all surprised that the two of you are being, the stewards of this story, really explaining it as people who helped make a new edition of A Course in Miracles for us, that you're helping us to give this a real framework so that we can share it responsibly, share this story, put it into the context of the full A Course in Miracles story. So I deeply appreciate, Jesus is thorough. Jesus doesn't do things off the cuff. Jesus chooses his channels wisely. So I trust the way that you are approaching this. I like that, I'm sort of unbridled enthusiasm, and you are both like, let's really get our arms around this. Let's understand this so that we can share it responsibly and in a way that everyone can see themselves in it. So I just want to express my deep appreciation for everything you've done. Like, your purple version of A Course in Miracles is my absolute favorite version. And I, again, always see things in terms of energy fields. The energy field of that purple book changed A Course in Miracles for me, because it told me I'm mature enough to get the whole story. There's nothing, I don't need anything not told to me. So I just want to thank you both deeply.
Thank you so much, Freedom, for that. And Robert, I'll let you close this out. But I want to say how much gratitude that I have to you and Laura Campoli for really wanting to share this story and make Isabel known. And I do feel a responsibility now that I didn't feel before to not only bring her into the light, bring the whole community, the Black community's involvement in Helen's story and the course itself to light, but to be a custodian for it, for future generations of course students. That is so incredibly important to me now in ways that it wasn't before, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that it's just, you said that Ida Bell, her story would be known on her time. And I think this whole movement is not only her time, but the time, right? Like the time that we are really looking. And so just thank you. I know that was wordy, but just thank you for what you've done. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Robert?
Well, you've both said it so well. I have little to add. I'm just really happy about how it's all unfolded, and hearing all the context you provide, Freedom. I could never have supplied that. You know, all the appreciation of this is part of kind of the American experience. So I have a much greater appreciation just having talked with you now. You do see it in Helen's autobiography. You're like dying for someone to care. And finally someone does. And you see how much it matters to her that she's seeking this connection with God, and feels some of that at that church. But listening to you, I feel like that story is set within this much greater context, which makes it so much more meaningful. So I just really appreciate you keeping at this, asking everybody, and pursuing it. And it sure seems like there is something invisible that wants this to come out. So it's great that we're helping that happen.
So I do get to close with, of all the old gods, only Ida Bell remains. And now her story, may it be known by all course students from now on. So thank you. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.